Good morning. Today we look at 2 Samuel 16, 17, and 18, and we find King David on the run. His son Absalom has assumed the kingship, and I just use that word assumed because Absalom doesn't serve very long in the scope of things in his kingship. But anyway, David has fled Jerusalem, and as he is fleeing, the Ziba, who is the servant of Saul's grandson, the crippled one, the child, Mephibosheth, comes with food, bread and grapes, or it says raisins, summer fruits, wine, and he brings all of these to King David and his troops, and King David is a little surprised by that. Why have you done this? And so there's when he asks, "Where is your master's son?" and well, he remains in Jerusalem, and then it's today he's going to give back my master's son, or he will get the kingdom back, basically, kind of, But anyway, he refers to David as my lord the king, and I don't understand all the intrigue in that, but that's okay. And verse 5, when King David and his troops come to this city Bahurim, there's a man who is of the family of Saul, somehow a relative, meets him, not with a friendly greeting, but with throwing stones at him and yelling insults and calling him a murderer and telling him, "Get out of here, you're not welcome here," rather than "Hail, hail, long live the king," it's, and one of David's men, says, "Well, should I go and dispatch him? Should I go kill him for what he's saying?" And I'm fleeing from my son, and he has a right to say what he's saying. He has I like, King David says he has a God-given right, to say that. Basically, is what he's saying, and but let him curse me, and King David continues on. Verse 15, we have again a little switch here with King Absalom, the David's son, and all of his Israelites, the ones who are following him, coming to Jerusalem, where the King David had lived, and he had fled, and as a way of establishing himself as the king, he is advised to take possession of all of the king's concubines and take possession of everything that had been King David's, so that he is established that way. And within this structuring, this Hushai, whom is faithful to King David and was left there as a spy, as we read, I think it was just yesterday, is asked by Absalom, "Well, why did you not go with my father, your friend?" And he says, "Well, I'm loyal to the king, and if you're the king, I'm going to be loyal to you. Why should I not serve you as I served your father?" We remember that, he's left there as a spy. And, and so, okay, so we do that. And, and then chapter 17 begins with Antiphol, who is one of Absalom's commanders of troops, saying, "Let me choose a bunch of men, and we'll go after your father, and we will dispatch him and his troops, and put an end to this." And he's got the plan all laid out. And then Absalom, somewhat foolishly, I think, consults Hushai, the spy that King David left behind. "Well, what do you think?" And of course, he comes up with a different plan. And Absalom, "Well, we'll do what Hushai says," and then, of course, when Hushai finds that out, he's going to send messengers to King David to let him know. Of course, these messengers, they get seen, and they are pursued, but a woman hides them. I mean, there's just so much intrigue going on here, and everything. But these messengers are successfully hidden. The searchers leave, and then they are let go. They, hidden in a well, covered up, by a woman, it says, and it's not surprising. It's how many different times do we see a woman hiding a messenger successfully? You know, it happens, and it's just, you know, one of the great roles, I think, in the Bible of those. But anyway, these messengers then come to King David and tell him, you know, make sure you and your troops all go across the river, and because this plan is coming. And so they all do that. They cross over at night, and as we come then into, the end of chapter 17, it says when David had gotten to this town, you know, they brought beds and basins and earthly vessels and wheat and barley, or they fed them because David and his army were hungry. So here was a community that supported King David and his men. And you think about, you know, the number of men they had in the army. I mean, it wasn't any easy task to feed that many, you know, especially, I mean, you know, you just couldn't call out to the restaurant to go. Huh? But chapter 18, King David and the men are there, and King David sets commanders over thousands and over hundreds, and, you know, so he's got a lot of troops, and they set everything up. And Joab is still one of his commanders, and so we were familiar with two of the commanders' names for certain here, and during the battle of everything, you know, Absalom, David's son, the king who you know, grabbed the throne, finds himself in a predicament as he's going under a tree on his donkey. He somehow gets caught in the branches, and the donkey leaves, and he's hanging there, you know, unable to get down, and then some of David's troops put him to death. You know, the fighting against the upstart king, and but it's one of those things that, you know, David had said, be gentle, be careful, you know, on Absalom. You know, David didn't really want his son killed that way, but even when it did happen, you know, in what is it, verse 10, 11, and 12, somewhere in there of chapter 18, you know, verse 12, the man said to Joab, even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not raise my hand against the king's son. You know, he did not want to be the one that killed Absalom. And then, you know, he says, you know, remember hearing that I heard the king command you and Ishbi and Ittai, the three commanders, you know, for my sake, protect the young man Absalom. You know, and so he's, you know, this person is reminding Joab of, this is the king's wish, you know, to protect him, be careful. But Joab takes 3 spears in his hand, and it says thrusts them into the heart, and the other young men strike him so that he dies, and they, you know, throw him into this burial pit, and then they send a runner back to King David, and then the second person says, let me run also. The first runner comes back, and King David asks, you know, what is the outcome? You know, he sees the sentinels, he sees someone coming, and he says, I think the one running is like this. And the king said, he's a good man and comes with good tidings. And then this runner cries out, all is well, and he prostrates himself, and blessed be the Lord who delivered all your men. And the king asks, is it well with the young man Absalom? And, you know, he kind of covers up. He says, I saw a great tumult, but I do not know what it was, you know. But he's aware, he truly is. But then the second runner comes, who is honest with King David. And he asks, David asks this second runner, the Cushite, is it well with the young man of Absalom? And the answer is, may the enemies of my Lord and King and all who rise up be like that young man. And in that statement, King David understood that his son had died or was killed in the battle. And, you know, we end with, the king was deeply moved, and he wept, saying, oh, my son, my son, my son Absalom, would that I had died instead of you. I mean, his grief for the death of his son was great, and I understand that totally. And as a parent, we know that we would we would gladly die for our children. And this is kind of David's predicament on this. This is David's feelings on this, that, you know, he much rather would have let his son live and carry on. But that wasn't what was all going to happen for the people of Israel. So we'll continue the journey tomorrow.